Jarek Vonn, a 20-year-old who found his refuge in the wild, embarked on a 2-week expedition into the rugged Trinity Alps, then vanished without a trace. For half a decade, the only lead was a vague sighting of him with a mysterious man, a detail that led nowhere and left the case cold. 5 years later, 2 hunters miles from any trail discovered his buried clothing, and inside the bundle, a heavy iron mechanism whose disturbing design would reveal a truth much darker than the wilderness itself. The Trinity Alps wilderness does not simply tolerate visitors, it tests them. By August 22, 2005, the vast expanse of Northern California granite and dense forest seemed to have swallowed Jarek Vonn whole. He was 4 days overdue. For his mother, Jarek Vonn, the silence radiating from the mountains was becoming unbearable. Jarek had planned a rigorous 2-week solo expedition, a journey deep into the heart of the Alps. But the agreed-upon return date of August 18th had come and gone without a phone call, without a message, without any sign of her 20-year-old son. Ilara contacted the Trinity County Sheriff's Office, her voice tight with a controlled panic that only a mother facing the unknown can possess. She explained that this wasn't just a casual camping trip. Jarek was different from most young men his age. He wasn't drawn to city life or conventional paths. He was drawn to the raw, unfiltered reality of the wilderness. Investigators began piecing together a portrait of the missing man. Jarek Vonn was exceptionally experienced, possessing a level of self-reliance that bordered on intense solitude. This independence was hard-earned. Jarek's father had died when he was very young, leaving Jarek and Ilara to navigate the world together. While they were close, Jarek found his refuge, his way of processing stress and grief, in nature. The more challenging the environment, the more comfortable he seemed. Ilara understood this need. She often hiked with him, driven by a lingering maternal worry despite his obvious competence. But Jarek frequently preferred to go alone. He relished the solitude, the complete immersion in the mountains, where the only sounds were the wind and the water. This trip to the Trinity Alps was significant. It was intended as a final major challenge, a capstone to his wilderness training before he embarked on an ambitious plan to travel the world solo. When speaking with the sheriff's office, Ilara emphasized Jarek's routine. This was crucial context for why she hadn't reported him missing the moment he was late. Jarek practiced a strict off-grid protocol. Once he entered the deep wilderness, he powered down all electronics. No cell phone, no GPS beacon, nothing that could tether him to the world he was trying to escape. This intentional disconnection, a standard practice for him, initially masked the seriousness of his absence. The first day overdue was explainable, perhaps a difficult pass or bad weather. The second day was concerning. By the 4th day, it felt catastrophic. Ilara provided the investigators with the last communication she had received, sent exactly 2 weeks prior, on August 4th. Jarek had reached the edge of a popular trail system, a transition point where the civilized world brushed against the untamed wilderness. He still had a faint cell signal, and he used it to send a final transmission. The transmission included several digital photographs. Some were sweeping vistas of the Trinity Alps, sharp, rocky peaks dusted with late summer snow, suggesting the high altitude he was aiming for. But one photo was different. It showed Jarek standing outdoors in the bright, clear midday sun. He was fully equipped, looking directly at the camera with a neutral, slightly serious expression. His eyes were obscured by large, dark-lensed sunglasses. He wore a wide-brimmed, bucket-style hat in a light tan color, and beneath it, the collar of a dark gray, hooded sweatshirt. His outermost layer was a vibrant turquoise-blue windbreaker. A large, black hiking backpack was strapped securely to his back, the top visible above his shoulders, indicating a heavy load for a long expedition. Unusually, he also wore a brown leather satchel across his chest. He gripped 2 black trekking poles, one in each hand, appearing ready and prepared. In the accompanying message, Jarek explained that he had encountered a friendly group of tourists from Indonesia at a scenic overlook. They had taken the photo for him. He reassured Alara that he was feeling strong, that the weather was perfect, and that he would see her in 2 weeks. He ended the message by telling her he loved her. Then the signal ceased. Recognizing the extreme ruggedness of the terrain Jarek intended to explore, the sheer scale of the Trinity Alps, and the fact that he was traveling alone, authorities didn't hesitate. An official missing person report was filed, and the mobilization of search and rescue operations began immediately. The search would focus on the area where Jarek Vonn had seemingly stepped off the map and vanished into the silence. The mobilization to find Jarek Vonn was swift and extensive. The Trinity Alps wilderness encompasses over 500,000 acres of some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in California. It is a landscape of deep canyons, sheer granite cliffs, and dense forests where trails are often faint and weather can turn treacherous without warning. For search and rescue teams, it was a high-stakes operation against an unforgiving environment. The initial search perimeter was established based on the location where Jarek's last photograph was taken, a popular scenic overlook near the junction of several major trailheads. This was the last known point of contact, the dividing line between Jarek's known movements and the vast unknown of the wilderness. Helicopters began grid searches from the air, scanning the exposed ridges and valleys for any sign of Jarek's vibrant blue jacket or a makeshift camp. On the ground, teams of experienced volunteers and law enforcement personnel, accompanied by tracking dogs, fanned out along the established trails. They were looking for any trace, a dropped piece of gear, a footprint, a disturbed patch of soil. The first investigative priority was to confirm Jarek's presence at the overlook and determine his intended route. Investigators needed to speak with the Indonesian tourists mentioned in his final message. Utilizing travel records and local lodging information, authorities managed to locate the group just before they departed the region. The tourists were cooperative, though shaken by the news of Jarek's disappearance. They confirmed the time and location of the encounter. They described Jarek as prepared, focused, and seemingly in good spirits. He had politely asked them to take his picture, chatted briefly about the beauty of the area, and then they parted ways. Crucially, they did not see which direction he ultimately took after their brief interaction. They assumed he continued along one of the main trails, but they hadn't paid close attention as they were focused on their own hike. The search continued for weeks, intensifying with each passing day. The scale of the operation was immense, but the wilderness yielded nothing. The trails remained empty. The tracking dogs found no scent. The aerial searches revealed no clues. It was as if Jarek had evaporated into the thin mountain air. Jarek was experienced in leave no trace hiking, which further complicated the efforts. He was meticulous about minimizing his impact on the environment, inadvertently erasing his own passage. As the intensive search efforts stretched into their 4th week, the reality of the situation began to set in. The probability of finding Jarek alive was diminishing rapidly. Jarek Vonn remained at the search headquarters, a constant presence, providing details about Jarek's specialized gear and his hiking preferences, clinging to the hope that her son's experience and resilience would see him through. But the strain was visible, the initial panic replaced by a profound, weary dread. It was during this period of fading hope that a new, critical piece of information surfaced. Missing person flyers featuring Jarek's photograph had been distributed throughout the region, posted at ranger stations, supply outposts, and local businesses. A man named Leander Horn, a professional wildlife photographer, recognized the face on one of the flyers at a remote supply outpost where he was resupplying. Horn contacted the investigators, stating he believed he had seen Jarek Vonn on the day he disappeared. Horn had been in the same overlook area later that afternoon, scouting locations for photographing high-altitude raptors. He distinctly remembered seeing the young man in the vibrant blue jacket and tan hat. But Jarek had not been alone. According to Horn, Jarek was engaged in conversation with an older man. The interaction seemed intense, focused. The older man was perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with a weathered, deeply lined face and a lean, sinewy build. What struck Horn as particularly unusual was the man's gear. In an era dominated by high-tech nylon and lightweight aluminum hiking equipment, this stranger was carrying antiquated, military-style canvas gear. His pack was heavy, utilitarian, and distinctly out of place among the modern hikers. It looked like surplus from a bygone era. Horn observed them from a distance, using his telephoto lens not to pry, but to assess the situation. He reported that the older man had produced a map, not a standard topographical map available at ranger stations, but something that looked specialized, perhaps hand-drawn or heavily annotated. Jarek and the stranger were looking intently at the map, the older man pointing toward a specific area away from the main trails, deeper into the unmarked wilderness. The interaction lasted several minutes. Then, crucially, Horn witnessed Jarek leaving the overlook with the older man. They did not take any of the established trails leading from the overlook. Instead, they headed toward a dense, less-traveled area, walking directly off-trail into the rugged terrain. Horn hadn't thought much of it at the time. He assumed the older man was perhaps a local guide, an old-timer with intimate knowledge of the area, showing the younger hiker a shortcut or a point of interest not marked on the standard maps. The interaction didn't appear coercive. Jarek seemed engaged and interested, seemingly trusting the expertise of the older man. But in the context of Jarek's disappearance, this observation took on a new, unsettling significance. Investigators pressed Horn for more details about the older man. Could he identify him? Did he hear any part of the conversation? Horn couldn't provide a name or any specific details of the conversation. The description was vague, older, weathered, military gear. In a region populated by eccentric locals, survivalists, and veterans seeking solitude, this description could fit dozens of individuals. The search efforts were redirected toward the area where Horn had seen the two men depart. This was significantly more challenging terrain, off-trail and densely wooded. The search teams meticulously combed the area, but again, they found no trace. No footprints, no campsites, nothing to indicate that Jarek or the stranger had passed that way. If the older man was skilled in wilderness travel, he could have easily obscured their path. The introduction of a second person complicated the investigation significantly. Was Jarek a victim of foul play, or had he simply chosen to alter his plans and hike with this experienced stranger, only to succumb to an accident in the remote wilderness? Despite the critical lead provided by Leander Horn, the investigation stalled. The wilderness held its secrets tightly. As the summer months faded into autumn, the weather conditions in the high altitudes began to worsen. Snowfall became frequent, making search operations increasingly hazardous. After 2 months of intensive effort, the active search for Jarek Vonn was officially scaled back. The resources were diverted. The volunteers returned home. Ilara Vonn was left grappling with the agonizing uncertainty of her son's fate. The disappearance of Jarek Vonn went cold, the mystery seemingly buried under the accumulating snow of the Trinity Alps. The only clue was the spectral image of a weathered stranger leading Jarek off the trail and into the unknown. 5 years passed. The disappearance of Jarek Vonn became one of the many cold cases haunting the Trinity Alps, a cautionary tale whispered among hikers and locals. Ilara Vonn never gave up hope, never stopped searching for answers, but the trail had vanished completely. The wilderness had moved on, the seasons turning, the landscape constantly reshaping itself, seemingly erasing the memory of the young hiker and the mysterious stranger. The narrative shifts to October 2010. The high country was preparing for winter, the air crisp and cold, the foliage turning vibrant shades of gold and red. Deep within a remote section of the Trinity Alps, miles from any established trail or human habitation, 2 men were moving silently through the dense forest. This was an area rarely traversed by humans, characterized by steep slopes and ancient trees. Mason Sykes was a professional hunting guide, intimately familiar with the rugged terrain of the Trinity Alps. He made his living leading clients into the backcountry in pursuit of elusive game. With him was his close friend, Leander Locke, an equally experienced outdoorsman. They were on a private hunting trip, tracking a large bull elk they had been pursuing for several days. This was not casual hunting. They were deep in the backcountry, navigating by map and compass, relying on their expertise to survive in the unforgiving environment. The area they were traversing was characterized by steep slopes, dense undergrowth, and large granite boulder formations, the kind of terrain where few humans ever ventured. They moved with practiced stealth, communicating through hand signals, their focus entirely on the subtle signs of the elk's passage. The forest floor was a thick carpet of moss, damp soil, and scattered dead leaves and twigs, muffling their footsteps. The lighting was subdued, the dense canopy of trees blocking out the midday sun, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. As they approached a particularly large granite boulder formation, a massive outcrop covered in thick green moss, Sykes signaled for Locke to halt. He had spotted something unusual. It wasn't a track or a sign of the elk. It was a disturbance in the earth. Near the base of the boulder, the ground was churned up. It was clear that an animal, likely a bear or a coyote, drawn by some scent, had been digging recently. The soil was fresh, the moss ripped away, exposing the dark earth beneath. Sykes approached cautiously, his rifle ready, scanning the area for the animal that had caused the disturbance. But it wasn't the animal that held his attention. Partially exposed in the shallow hole dug by the animal was the corner of something artificial, something that didn't belong in this pristine wilderness. It was a dull gray color, the texture of heavy plastic or canvas, a tarp or a heavy-duty sack. Sykes felt a surge of frustration. His initial assumption was that someone had illegally dumped trash in the backcountry, a blatant disregard for the wilderness he revered. It wasn't uncommon to find abandoned campsites or discarded gear, but this felt different. It was buried, concealed, until the animal had unearthed it. He called Locke over, gesturing toward the partially exposed sack with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. Sykes knelt down, brushing away the loose soil and debris. He grabbed the exposed corner of the sack and pulled. It was heavy, lodged firmly in the ground, weighted down by its contents and the damp soil. He pulled harder, the plastic tearing slightly as it resisted the pull. With a final heave, he unearthed the sack from the shallow hole. It was a large, heavy-duty gray plastic tarp tightly wrapped around a bulky mass of objects. The tarp was sealed, folded meticulously to protect its contents from the elements. Sykes untangled the folds, spreading the tarp open on the mossy ground. Inside, they found a pile of clothing. It was immediately apparent that these were not discarded rags. It was hiking gear, soiled with dirt and mud, crumpled and compressed from being buried. A vibrant blue jacket, now stained and dull, but still recognizable by its color. A tan bucket hat, misshapen and dirty. A brown leather satchel, partially tucked under the jacket, the leather stiff and damp. The initial annoyance shifted to confusion, then to a growing sense of unease. This wasn't trash. This was someone's gear. Why would anyone bury their clothing deep in the wilderness? It suggested something more than just littering. It suggested concealment. Locke knelt beside Sykes, inspecting the items. He reached into the pile, sifting through the clothing, looking for any identification or explanation. His hand brushed against something hard and metallic, hidden within the folds of the blue jacket. He pulled it out. It was a heavy, bizarre metallic object. They stared at it, utterly bewildered. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The object was about a foot long, heavily rusted, with a mottled brown and orange patina covering its surface. It had a stem, like a handle, and at the top a bulbous structure composed of several metal segments, opened in a flower-like shape. The segments were pointed, menacing. Locke turned it over in his hands. It looked ancient, medieval. "What in the world is this?" he muttered, the object feeling cold and heavy in his grasp. Sykes examined the object, his expression grim. The design was intricate, precise, and inherently cruel. He recognized the mechanism, having seen similar devices in historical documentaries. "I don't know," he replied, his voice low, "but it looks like some kind of torture device." The statement hung in the air, heavy and chilling. A torture device, buried with a pile of clothing, deep in the remote wilderness. It made no sense, yet the implications were terrifying. The disturbing nature of the object immediately altered the atmosphere. The silence of the forest suddenly felt oppressive, threatening. They had heard stories, rumors of strange disappearances, of people vanishing into the mountains, of the dark secrets hidden within the vast wilderness. They stood up, scanning the surrounding area with a new perspective. They were no longer hunters. They were witnesses to something dark and inexplicable. They briefly searched the immediate vicinity, looking for any other disturbed earth, any sign of a larger burial site, a clandestine grave. They found nothing, just the shallow hole where the sack had been buried. The meticulous burial of the clothing and the torture device, but the absence of a body, was profoundly unsettling. It suggested a complex crime scene, a deliberate separation of evidence. Sykes knew they couldn't leave the items there. This was evidence. Evidence of what? They didn't know, but it was significant. They carefully repacked the items into the gray plastic tarp. Their hunting trip was over. They needed to get these findings to the authorities. But they were deep in the backcountry, 3 days of hard hiking from the nearest ranger station. They began the long trek out, the heavy, ominous burden of their discovery weighing on them far more than the gear in their packs. For 3 days they hiked through the rugged terrain, the rusted object in Sykes's pack a constant reminder of the darkness they had unearthed. When they finally reached the sheriff's office, exhausted and grim, they delivered the findings, recounting the details of their discovery. They had no idea that the contents of the gray plastic sack were about to crack open a 5-year-old mystery and expose a horror hidden deep within the Trinity Alps. The arrival of the gray plastic sack at the Trinity County Sheriff's Office catalyzed a flurry of activity. The items discovered by Mason Sykes and Leander Locke were immediately transferred to the forensic lab for processing. The location of the discovery, deep in the remote wilderness, combined with the bizarre nature of the contents, suggested a high probability of foul play. The forensic team began the meticulous process of examining the items. The clothing, the blue jacket, the tan hat, the brown leather satchel was soiled and degraded, but remarkably well preserved considering it had been buried for an indeterminate amount of time. The heavy-duty plastic tarp had effectively sealed the contents, protecting them from the elements and the decomposition process that would have otherwise destroyed them. The first step was to identify the owner of the clothing. The items were photographed and cross-referenced with regional cold cases, searching for any missing persons, matching the description of the gear. The vibrant blue jacket was distinctive. It didn't take long for investigators to find a match. They pulled the cold case file for Jarek Vonn. The photograph taken at the Overlook 5 years earlier was placed side by side with the recovered items. The match was undeniable. The blue jacket, the hat, the unusual brown leather satchel, it was all there. The discovery was a bombshell. After 5 years of silence, the first physical trace of Jarek Vonn had surfaced, buried deep in the wilderness. But the context of the discovery was chilling. This was not an abandoned campsite or gear lost in an accident. This was a burial site. While the identification of the clothing provided a strong presumptive link to Jarek Vonn, investigators needed definitive proof. The forensic team focused on extracting DNA from the clothing. Despite the degradation, the preservation provided by the plastic tarp offered a viable opportunity. Swabs were taken from the collar of the jacket, the sweatband of the hat, and the interior of the satchel, areas most likely to retain biological material. The DNA analysis confirmed the initial identification. The DNA extracted from the clothing matched the profile of Jarek Vonn, derived from samples provided by his mother, Ilara, 5 years earlier. Ilara Vonn was notified of the discovery. The news was a devastating blow, extinguishing the faint hope that Jarek might still be alive, perhaps having started a new life elsewhere. The discovery confirmed her worst fears, but it also raised new, agonizing questions. What had happened to her son, and why were his clothes buried with a strange, rusted object? While the forensic team processed the clothing, the rusted metallic object discovered by the hunters was subjected to expert analysis. It was unlike any weapon or tool typically encountered in criminal investigations. It was heavy, intricate, and seemingly archaic. The object was sent to a historian specializing in medieval history and weaponry at a university forensic anthropology department. The identification came back quickly, and it was profoundly disturbing. The object was a pair of anguish. The pair of anguish is a historical device specifically designed for torture. It consists of a bulbous metal body divided into several segments, connected by a hinge and a screw mechanism, though the screw mechanism was missing, or rusted shut on the recovered item. The device was inserted into an orifice of the victim and then expanded, causing the segments to spread outward, tearing the flesh and causing excruciating pain, internal mutilation, and often death. The object found with Jarek's clothing was a replica, likely handcrafted but fully functional. The segments were expanded, suggesting it had been deployed. This discovery fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation. This was no longer a missing person case or even a standard homicide. This was a case involving extreme violence, sadism, and premeditated torture. The discovery of the pair of anguish painted a horrifying picture of Jarek Vonn's final moments. The investigation immediately shifted focus to the discovery site. A team of forensic experts and investigators was airlifted to the remote location identified by the hunters. The area was meticulously searched, the soil sifted, the surrounding terrain combed for any additional evidence. They were looking for human remains. They utilized ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, conducting an exhaustive search of the area surrounding the granite boulders. But they found nothing, no bones, no teeth, no sign of a body. This presented a disturbing anomaly. The perpetrator had meticulously buried the victim's clothes and the torture device, wrapping them in plastic. This suggested a degree of planning, of meticulousness. But where was the body? Why bury the evidence but not the victim? The preservation suggested perhaps the killer wanted to retain these items, burying them for later retrieval. The absence of a body complicated the investigation, but the presence of the pair of anguish provided compelling evidence of extreme violence. Investigators began developing a profile of the perpetrator based on the evidence at hand. The profile was chilling and specific. The perpetrator was likely an expert survivalist, intimately familiar with the remote wilderness of the Trinity Alps. He was capable of navigating off-trail, surviving in the harsh environment, and concealing his activities from detection for years. He was meticulous, organized, and possibly forensically aware. The burial of the evidence suggested a highly organized individual, someone who planned carefully and sought to control the scene. He possessed a specific, disturbing obsession with historical violence and torture. The pair of anguish was not a common weapon. It indicated a specialized knowledge, a fascination with archaic methods of inflicting pain. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was the work of a predator with specific dark interests. The profile suggested a highly dangerous individual, patient, intelligent, and deeply disturbed. Investigators returned to the 2005 witness statement provided by Leander Horn. The wildlife photographer had seen Jarek Vonn leaving the overlook with an older, weathered man carrying antiquated, military-style canvas gear. At the time, the observation was anomalous but not overtly suspicious. Now, in the context of the pair of anguish and the profile of the killer, the description of the stranger took on a critical significance. The antiquated military gear suggested a background in survival, perhaps a military background, which aligned with the historical nature of the torture device. The fact that he was carrying a specialized map and leading Jarek off-trail indicated an intimate knowledge of the area. The investigation now had a focus. They needed to identify the stranger seen with Jarek Vonn 5 years earlier. The realization settled in. The phantom figure seen with Jarek was likely the killer. The hunt for the ghost of the Trinity Alps had begun. The profile of the killer pointed toward a specific type of individual: a recluse, a survivalist, someone living on the fringes of society, hidden within the vast wilderness of the Trinity Alps. The investigation faced a daunting challenge. How do you find a ghost in a landscape that spans over 500,000 acres? Investigators began a meticulous operation to identify individuals matching the profile and the 2005 description provided by Leander Horn. They focused on the small, isolated communities scattered around the perimeter of the Trinity Alps, towns where residents valued privacy and eccentricity was common. They interviewed locals, bartenders, shopkeepers, and forest rangers, asking about individuals known to live off-grid, individuals with military backgrounds, individuals who exhibited strange or threatening behavior. The inquiries were subtle, designed not to alert the potential suspect, but the responses were often vague and guarded. The culture of these mountain communities was inherently suspicious of outsiders, particularly law enforcement. Despite the challenges, recurring mentions of a specific individual began to emerge. Locals spoke of a volatile, intensely private man who appeared every few months in one of the small towns near the wilderness boundary. He was described as a recluse, a man of few words, with a weathered appearance and an unsettling intensity. He would drift into town, take temporary work, usually menial labor, or bartending at a specific dive bar, earning just enough cash to resupply before disappearing back into the mountains for months at a time. He paid in cash, avoided any paper trail, and interacted with locals only when absolutely necessary. He fit the age range described by Horn, late 50s or early 60s, and was known to utilize old durable gear. The man was identified as Idris Rook. A background check on Idris Rook revealed a history that aligned chillingly with the profile of the killer. Rook was a veteran of the Cold War, but he wasn't just a soldier. His military records, though heavily redacted, indicated specialized training in psychological operations, PSYOPs, interrogation techniques, and survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SERE training. He had served in various capacities during the Cold War, operating in clandestine environments, trained to inflict and withstand extreme physical and psychological pressure. The Cold War background provided a critical context for his expertise in survival and his fascination with torture. The interrogation techniques developed and utilized during that era often bordered on the barbaric, utilizing methods designed to break the human mind and body. Rook was trained in these methods. Locals knew him as an eccentric and sometimes menacing figure. He was described as having a hair-triggered temper, prone to outbursts of volatility when provoked. He was a man to be avoided, a shadow figure haunting the fringes of the community. The discovery of Rook's background galvanized the investigation. They had a suspect who not only matched the physical description and the behavioral profile, but also possessed the specialized skills and training necessary to commit the crime and evade detection for 5 years. Investigators began surveillance on Idris Rook. They discovered he maintained a sparse one-room apartment in town, rented under an assumed name. He used the apartment intermittently, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for a few weeks, before vanishing again. The surveillance confirmed his routine. He worked at the rundown tavern, keeping to himself, his interactions brief and transactional. He was observant, constantly scanning his surroundings, exhibiting a level of situational awareness that suggested his military training remained deeply ingrained. While the surveillance in town provided valuable intelligence on Rook's habits and demeanor, tracking his movements when he left town proved incredibly difficult. He didn't own a vehicle. He would leave town on foot, usually under the cover of darkness, disappearing into the dense forest surrounding the community. When investigators attempted to follow him, they found themselves outmatched. Rook operated with a level of tradecraft that suggested his training was still very much active. He utilized military evasion tactics, doubling back on his trail, using the terrain to his advantage, and seemingly vanishing into the wilderness. It was clear that he was not just a hiker, he was a trained operative, comfortable in the wilderness and adept at avoiding detection. Authorities determined that Rook must have a hidden, permanent shelter somewhere deep in the Trinity Alps. The town apartment was just a foothold in the civilized world, a staging point. His true home was in the wilderness. They needed to find where Rook retreated, the place where he likely kept the secrets of his dark obsessions. The investigators hypothesized that he had built an illegal shelter on public land, a base of operations where he could operate without fear of discovery. Locating this shelter became the primary objective of the investigation. They launched a targeted operation utilizing advanced aerial surveillance, including thermal imaging and high-resolution photography. They analyzed potential supply routes, focusing on areas with access to water and resources, areas remote enough to avoid detection. They analyzed patterns in his movements, trying to triangulate the location of his base. The search was painstaking, complicated by the rugged terrain and the dense forest canopy. Rook was an expert in camouflage and concealment, skills honed during his military service. Months passed, with numerous potential sites investigated and dismissed. Finally, in early 2011, the aerial surveillance team identified an anomaly, a faint thermal signature, barely detectable, emanating from a densely wooded ravine deep in the wilderness. High-resolution photography revealed a subtle disturbance in the forest canopy, a slight variation in the vegetation that suggested a man-made structure. They had found it. An illegally built, well-camouflaged cabin, almost undetectable from the air or ground. It was located in a remote, inaccessible area, miles from any trail or road. It was small, well-camouflaged, and built into the side of a hill, utilizing the natural terrain to mask its presence. The location was remote, isolated, and strategically positioned to provide maximum concealment. Investigators were convinced this was Idris Rook's lair. The discovery marked a critical turning point. They now had a location, a place where the answers to the 5-year mystery of Jarek Vonn's disappearance might be found. The stage was set for a confrontation with the ghost of the Alps. By early 2011, the investigation into Idris Rook had reached a critical juncture. The discovery of his hidden cabin, combined with his specialized military background and the circumstantial evidence linking him to Jarek Vonn's disappearance, provided sufficient probable cause for search warrants. Investigators had also discovered, through financial tracking associated with his alias, that Rook rented a storage locker in the same town where he maintained his sparse apartment. The plan was to execute simultaneous raids on all 3 locations, the apartment, the storage locker, and the wilderness cabin, to prevent Rook from destroying evidence or escaping. The operation was high risk. Rook was a trained operative, likely armed, and an expert in survival and evasion, operating on his home ground. The raid on the wilderness cabin required a tactical team specialized in wilderness operations, airlifted into the remote location, prepared for a potential confrontation. The operation was meticulously planned. In the pre-dawn hours of March 12, 2011, the operation commenced. The tactical team deployed to the cabin utilized the element of surprise, approaching the structure under the cover of darkness. They breached the cabin door, securing the structure in a matter of seconds. Idris Rook was inside. He was apprehended without incident, seemingly unsurprised by the arrival of the tactical team. He was calm, composed, his expression unreadable, exhibiting a chilling calm that unnerved the arresting officers. Simultaneously, investigators executed the search warrants on the town apartment and the storage locker. The apartment in town was nearly empty, containing only basic necessities and showing signs of infrequent use. it yielded little evidence of significance. It was clear that this was not his home. It was a transient space, a temporary foothold in the civilized world. The storage locker, however, was a different story. When investigators cut the lock and opened the unit, they were confronted with a disturbing collection of items that hinted at the depth of Rook's obsessions. The locker was meticulously organized, reflecting the organizational skills noted in the profile. They found detailed anatomy charts, both human and animal, annotated with precise markings indicating pressure points and nerve clusters. Alongside the charts were veterinary surgical tools, clean and sterilized, far exceeding the needs of basic first aid. The most disturbing discovery in the locker was a collection of meticulously cleaned animal bones, deer, coyote, bear, displaying signs of precise trauma and fractures, consistent with experimentation rather than hunting or scavenging. The bones were categorized and labeled, suggesting a systematic study of trauma. Furthermore, they found several other historical torture device replicas, similar in craftsmanship to the Pair of Anguish. These included thumbscrews, iron masks, and other implements of torment. The collection suggested a deep-seated fascination with the mechanics of pain. Tucked away in a secure container were old military manuals detailing Cold War interrogation methods, psychological warfare techniques, and the effects of extreme duress on the human body. The storage locker was a repository of Rook's dark research, a place where he stored the tools and knowledge of his trade. Meanwhile, at the wilderness cabin, the investigation team was uncovering a scene of horror. The cabin was clearly where Rook spent the majority of his time, the place where he put his research into practice. It was a workshop of horrors dedicated to the systematic exploration of violence. Investigators found extensive evidence of long-term animal torture and experimentation. The scale and severity of the findings far surpassed the cleaned bones found in the storage locker. They discovered restraining devices, makeshift surgical tables, and surgical implements covered in dried blood. Detailed logs documented the experiments conducted on the animals. The logs were written in a cryptic, precise language, utilizing military terminology and codes, describing the effects of various torture methods with a chilling clinical detachment. The cabin itself was a testament to Rook's survival skills. It was self-sufficient, with a sophisticated system for collecting rainwater, a wood-burning stove for heat, and extensive stores of preserved food. It was clear that Rook could survive here indefinitely, isolated from the world. Among the disturbing artifacts in the cabin, investigators found a collection of detailed, hand-drawn topographical maps of the surrounding area. The maps were meticulously crafted, indicating a level of detail that surpassed standard USGS maps. They were annotated with symbols and markings that were unfamiliar to the investigators. With Rook in custody and the evidence from the 3 locations secured, the investigation moved to the interrogation phase. Rook was questioned extensively by detectives experienced in dealing with hardened criminals. However, Rook was unlike any suspect they had encountered. He was cold, controlled, and unsettlingly calm. His demeanor reflected his specialized training in resisting interrogation, SERE. He answered questions with precise, evasive language, offering plausible deniability for the disturbing items found in his possession. He dismissed the torture devices as historical research, claiming he was a collector of military artifacts and history enthusiast. He explained the animal bones and surgical tools as wilderness survival practice, stating he studied animal anatomy to improve his hunting and trapping skills. When questioned about Jarek Vonn, Rook denied any knowledge of the young hiker. He claimed he had never met him and had no involvement in his disappearance. He maintained his composure throughout the interrogation, exhibiting no signs of stress or deception. He controlled the flow of information, manipulating the narrative, offering just enough cooperation to appear compliant while revealing nothing incriminating. The interrogation reached an impasse. Rook maintained his innocence, his demeanor unwavering. Critically, despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence and the horrific discoveries made at the cabin and storage locker, investigators faced a significant legal hurdle. They found nothing directly linking Idris Rook to Jarek Vonn. None of Jarek's belongings were found in Rook's possession. No DNA evidence linking Rook to Jarek was found at the cabin or on the recovered clothing. The initial analysis of the clothing had only yielded Jarek's DNA. While the evidence strongly suggested Rook was the killer, it did not meet the threshold for probable cause required to charge him with murder. The animal torture, while horrific, was a separate set of crimes, and the possession of the torture devices was not illegal in itself. The legal reality was stark. They did not have enough evidence to hold him. The district attorney reviewed the case and concluded that despite the disturbing nature of the findings, there was insufficient direct evidence to proceed with a murder charge. Authorities were legally compelled to release Idris Rook. The decision was devastating for the investigation team and for Jarek Vonn. They watched as the man they were certain was responsible for Jarek's torture and murder walked free. Immediately upon his release, Idris Rook disappeared back into the wilderness, vanishing like a ghost into the vast expanse of the Trinity Alps. The investigation had identified the monster, but they had failed to stop him. The release of Idris Rook was a crushing setback. The investigation stalled, paralyzed by the lack of direct evidence linking him to Jarek Vonn. Investigators were certain they had the right man: the profile, the background, the horrific discoveries at his cabin. It all pointed to Rook. But moral certainty was not enough for a conviction. They needed definitive proof, and crucially, they needed to find Jarek's body. Following Rook's disappearance back into the wilderness, the investigation turned inward, focusing on the vast collection of evidence seized from the cabin and the storage locker. They had to believe that Rook, despite his meticulous nature and training, had made a mistake, that somewhere within the artifacts of his dark life there was a clue that would lead them to Jarek. Analysts meticulously reviewed every item, every document, every photograph. The focus shifted intensely to the collection of detailed, hand-drawn topographical maps found at the cabin. These maps were unique, crafted with a precision that suggested Rook's military training. They depicted the remote sections of the Trinity Alps where Rook operated, areas far from established trails, rendered with intimate knowledge of the terrain. During the review, analysts noticed subtle, precise annotations on the maps. These were not standard cartographic symbols. They were small, intricate markings, seemingly randomly placed, but executed with the same meticulous care as the maps themselves. The investigators realized these markings were deliberate, meaningful, but their meaning was obscured. The annotations utilized obscure symbols and codes that were unfamiliar to the civilian analysts. They suspected these might be related to Rook's military background, a specialized language used for operational planning or recording activities in the field. The maps were sent to a specialist in military intelligence and cryptography at the Department of Defense. The specialist was an expert in Cold War-era military codes and communication protocols, the same era in which Rook had served. The specialist began the painstaking process of analyzing the symbols, attempting to decipher their meaning in the context of Rook's specialized background in PSYOPS and interrogation. The breakthrough came when the specialist cross-referenced the symbols on the maps with the specialized military manuals found in Rook's storage unit. The manuals detailed obscure protocols for psychological operations and the management of clandestine sites used during the Cold War. Within these manuals, hidden in appendices detailing coded communication for field operatives, the specialist found the key to the symbols. Rook was using a modified version of a Cold War-era code used for designating secure locations and recording sensitive operations. The symbols on the maps did not indicate supply caches, trails, or campsites. They designated something far more sinister. The specialist deciphered the notations as indicating disposal zones or field test sites. Rook had been meticulously recording the locations of his activities, utilizing his specialized training to conceal the information in plain sight. The maps were a ledger of his horrors, a cartographic representation of his hunting ground. The specialist focused on a specific cluster of symbols that seemed to indicate a primary disposal site, marked with a unique identifier that suggested human remains. They deciphered the coordinates, which corresponded to an almost inaccessible area in a high-altitude ravine, characterized by deep, narrow rock crevices and sheer cliffs. This location was miles from Rook's cabin and far from the site where Jarek's clothes had been found. It was an area so remote and rugged that it had never been searched during the initial operations in 2005. With the location identified, a specialized climbing team was deployed to the area. The terrain was treacherous, requiring advanced climbing skills and equipment to access the ravine. They arrived at the coordinates and began a systematic search of the rock crevices. The crevices were deep and narrow, shafts of darkness cutting into the granite cliffs. The search was slow and dangerous, requiring the team members to be lowered into the crevices by rope, their visibility limited to the beams of their headlamps. Deep within one particularly narrow dry crevice, they made the discovery. They located human remains, wedged deep within the rock formation, hidden from the sky above. The process of recovering the remains was complex and difficult, requiring several hours of careful maneuvering to extract the body from the crevice without disturbing the evidence. The remains were transported to the forensic anthropology lab for analysis. The identification was quickly confirmed. The remains belonged to Jarek Vonn. The specific environmental conditions within the rock crevice had played a crucial role in the preservation of the remains. The dry, cool air, the constant airflow, and the lack of sunlight had created a microclimate that resulted in partial mummification rather than full skeletonization. The body was desiccated, but the soft tissues were partially preserved. This preservation allowed the forensic pathologists to conduct a detailed examination of the remains. They identified clear signs of prolonged torture. The injuries were extensive and horrific, consistent with the use of the pair of anguish and other devices found in Rook's possession. The extent of the trauma indicated that Jarek had suffered immensely before his death, validating the terrifying implications of the evidence found in Rook's cabin. Crucially, the preservation of the soft tissues allowed for the recovery of foreign DNA. Forensic technicians meticulously swabbed the areas of the body where the perpetrator would have made contact during the torture and the disposal of the remains. The analysis yielded a DNA profile. The profile was compared against the reference sample taken from Idris Rook during his brief time in custody. The results were definitive. The DNA found on Jarek Vonn's remains belonged to Idris Rook. The discovery of Jarek's body and the DNA match provided the definitive proof the investigation needed. The meticulous records Rook kept, the coded maps that he believed only he could understand, had ultimately led to his downfall. The 5-year mystery of Jarek Vonn's disappearance had been solved, revealing a horror far darker than anyone had imagined. With the forensic analysis complete, the evidence was irrefutable. Idris Rook was responsible for the abduction, torture, and murder of Jarek Vonn. An arrest warrant was immediately issued, and a massive manhunt was launched throughout the Trinity Alps. This time, the objective was not investigation, but apprehension. Authorities understood the gravity of the situation. They were pursuing a dangerous, highly trained survivalist on his own territory, a man who knew the wilderness intimately and possessed the skills to evade capture indefinitely. Furthermore, Rook knew the investigation was closing in. His release from custody had been a temporary reprieve, and he likely anticipated their return. The manhunt involved multiple agencies, including tactical teams, tracking experts, and aerial support, converging on the area surrounding Rook's cabin and the newly discovered disposal sites. The operation was conducted with extreme caution. Rook was assumed to be armed and dangerous, a predator cornered in his lair. The teams moved systematically through the rugged terrain, tracking his movements, looking for any sign of his passage. The hunt was intense, driven by the knowledge of the horrific nature of his crimes. After several days of intensive tracking, a tactical team identified a faint trail leading away from the cabin, heading toward a remote, high-altitude area. They followed the trail, the tension mounting with every step. They were closing in on the ghost of the Alps. As they approached a dense section of forest, they spotted a figure lying on the ground. They moved in, weapons raised, securing the area. The figure was motionless. They identified the individual as Idris Rook. He was deceased. A firearm was found next to him. The scene was secured, and the coroner was later called to the location. The examination determined that Rook had died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It appeared that Rook, realizing that his capture was imminent and that the evidence against him was insurmountable, had chosen to end his life rather than face justice. Jarek Vonn's remains were returned to Jarek Vonn, providing a grim closure to the agonizing 5-year ordeal. The discovery of the coded maps and the horrors within the cabin revealed the extent of Rook's depravity. The investigation concluded that Rook, twisted by the psychological trauma of his Cold War service and obsessed with the mechanics of violence, had turned the pristine wilderness of the Trinity Alps into his personal hunting ground, a solitary monster who ultimately chose the coward's way out. Jarek Vonn finally laid her son to rest in a small cemetery overlooking the mountains he had loved. Though the case was closed, the horror of what happened to Jarek left a permanent scar on the small mountain community. For Ilara, knowing the truth was both a relief and a burden. The uncertainty was over, but the knowledge of her son's final days would haunt her forever.